Alright guys, this is part 2 of the Connerland APUSH review for 2013-14, and in this time we're going to talk about chapter 4 from the crash course book, The American Revolutionary Era from 1754 to 1789. Alright guys, more or less this entire chapter deals with the road to revolution, and the road to revolution begins with the French and Indian War. As you know, it was it was a worldwide war, also known as the 7 Years' War. The result of it is really all you need to know, and the result of it is that France is basically kicked out of North America, and when they are, Great Britain picks up a lot more land, and also as a security precaution needs to keep troops over here. And to do that, they've got to be able to pay for it, and the way that they decide to pay for it is they decide to impose what are called revenue taxes, which are taxes strictly for the purpose of raising money. And when they do that, there is some tension that begins to start between them and the colonists, and as we go forward, you see these tensions becoming more and more to the point where it breaks out into a war. Next on the list of things that lead to rising tensions between the colonists and Great Britain is the Proclamation of 1763, in which, if you can see on the map here, and I know it's probably kind of tiny, but the British did not want the colonists advancing or settling past this line, which is roughly around the Appalachian Mountains running north to south. The reason they didn't want this to happen is because they wanted to avoid tensions or conflicts between the colonists and Native Americans. So they put this line in and said don't cross it, and basically the colonists ignored it. Next on the list is the Stamp Act, and this is when things start to get real, because this is where the protests and the boycotts and other forms of I don't know, I guess of them acting out, the colonists acting out, begin. And the Stamp Act was put out in 1765, and it was once again strictly to raise revenue for British troops. This is where the cries that you normally associate with the American Revolution, like no taxation without representation, and things like that, start to come into play. Now, Britain counters this by talking about something called virtual representation, where they said that even though you didn't have someone sitting in Parliament voicing the concerns of the colonies, you still were represented because you're a possession of England. The Stamp Act, one of the ways in which they reacted to it, obviously I said, mobs, boycotting, protests, tarring and feathering, collectors, stuff like that. And eventually they end up boycotting British goods. And when they do that, it begins to put a little bit of economic pressure on Britain. And once that happens, the people who run the businesses begin to start talking to Parliament, and they eventually decide to repeal the Stamp Act. Now, they're not going to let it go after this, but it's seen as a little bit of a victory for the colonists. Now, through a combination of the repeal of the Stamp Act and also the Boston Tea Party, Britain decides they want to punish the colonists, and in particular they want to punish Massachusetts Bay, and they do this through the coercive acts, which for the purpose of us, the main thing you need to concern yourself with is the fact that they closed the port of Boston, which basically means no ships in, no ships out, and it cripples the economy of the northern colonies, and in particular the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Next on our list of things that led to the Revolutionary War is Common Sense, which is a pamphlet that was put out by a guy named Thomas Paine, and in it, it is an overall call for independence, but the thing that really got to people and really got people in the colonies ready to revolt, ready to start this revolution, was the fact that he made some pretty compelling arguments, one of which being he told people to look around the world and see if there's anywhere in nature or anywhere in the world where the small rules the large. And he applied that to the colonists in England. Because remember, England is a relatively tiny island, and they're ruling over this entire large landmass of North America at this time, even though there hasn't been a lot of westward exploration and stuff. He just didn't see it as something natural where a small place could rule a large one. Couple more influences on the road revolution. The first is the Enlightenment, which was a intelligent or an intellectual movement in Europe that really influenced a lot of the founding fathers and the guys who got this revolution going and wrote the Declaration of Independence and all that kind of stuff. Enlightenment, a couple of the concepts that played into this were natural law and natural rights, and you can see those ideals embodied in the Declaration of Independence. Another one is deism, which is a belief where God created the world and then he just kind of went hands off on it. He said, it's up to y'all. And that ties once again into the natural law and natural rights and things that colonists were wanting at this time. Next is the Declaration of Independence, and obviously this is kind of the turning point of it. It's not really the point of no going back, but it kind of is. Simply because this was a list of grievances against King George. So we were laying out what was upsetting us, or in this case I say us, I mean the colonists, what was upsetting them about how he was acting, about the tyrannical rule in which he had and the things that he had done wrong. So know that it was a list of grievances against the king, and also that it was heavily inspired by Enlightenment thought. So now we get to the war itself, which lasts from 1776 to 1781. And you don't need to know all the battles. You don't need to know the specifics of everything, but there's a couple of broad themes you need to be aware of. And the first is the reasons why the colonists, to a large extent, supported the war. Now, it wasn't everybody, but a majority of the people in the colonies did support this. And first of all, it's because of the tyranny that was seen to be placed on them by King George. Also, there was a significant amount of parliamentary control in their eyes, and also they wanted greater control for themselves. They were getting kind of used to running things on their own. They had, had a certain amount of autonomy for the years prior to the revolution, and they didn't want to relinquish that. As soon as Britain started throwing these acts on them and things, it upset them because they weren't used to being treated as colonists. While I said you don't have to know the specifics of every battle and every war that we talk about, you do need to kind of know which ones were the turning points in the conflicts. And for the Revolutionary War, this is Saratoga. And it's important for a couple of reasons. Well, really one main reason. It's because it convinces the French to come in on our side. And they do this for a couple of reasons. Number one, they want to weaken Britain. All right, we talked about in class how they had never really liked each other up to this point, and it's just another way to get back at them for their loss and for the French loss in the French and Indian War. And other things that they suffered throughout the years and other grievances that they had against England. And plus, from a European standpoint, European history standpoint, if they can weaken Britain, it's very good for their standing on the continent. A couple of ways in which they helped out. First of all, they sent some military leadership over here, and they also sent supplies and weapons and things like that. So we kind of had to prove ourselves before they would come in and give us a hand, and Saratoga was the time in which we did that. So we'll talk about a lot of treaties as we go through this, and the first one is the Treaty of Paris in 1783, which signals the end of the Revolutionary War. Now, the most significant thing out of this is that Great Britain is basically kicked out of North America. We take everything over, and we, for the first time, have our independence. And along with that comes a lot of troubles and a lot of hardships down the line, as well as a lot of opportunities. So as we go forward, we'll be talking about how do you basically put a country together from scratch in a new way that people haven't really tried before, and the fact that we have a Republican government, democracy is a part of it, and we have federal power versus states' rights, and that's what we'll focus on as we go. So we now have reached independence, and we've got to figure out a way to run this place. And the first document that is decided upon to basically govern our country is the Articles of Confederation. Now, there's a couple concerns that come about in this, and the first one is the fact that people are scared of giving a lot of control to a centralized government, because that's what they were arguing about with Great Britain that led to the Revolutionary War. So they're going to design something that gives basically all the powers to the states at the expense of the federal government. Yeah, it's there and it can do certain things, but it's not going to have any overreaching overpower, I guess, if you want to call it that. As far as the thing that you need to focus on is really the weaknesses of it, and the weaknesses are, number one, a lack of authority to tax, and number two is a lack of authority to exercise authority directly over the states. So there's a lot of safeguards and things that keep it from imposing upon states' rights. The most important thing that it does, or one of the most important things, and I don't have this on here, but we talked about it in class, is the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. And you need to know the components of it and what it did, and that's in your review book, and like I said, we talked about it in class. So we're rolling along with the Articles of Confederation, and everything's, I guess you could say, going pretty well, until, even though it does have a lot of weaknesses, it's going okay until Shays' Rebellion, and it was led by a guy named Daniel Shays. And it's a lot of what it comes from is farmers are frustrated, and particularly they're frustrated at their economic situation. They're really unable to pay their debts at this time because debts have to be paid in gold and silver, or what is referred to as hard currency. And they're starting to lose their farms because they can't pay these debts. So it's not a rebellion, first of all. It's not an attempt to overthrow a government. It's an airing of grievances. And some of the things they're looking for in the review book was they're trying to end farm foreclosures, end imprisonment for death, relief from their taxation, and the increased circulation of paper money so they'll be able to pay their debts. Once again, just looking for reforms, not an effort to overthrow the government, but what it does is it convinces people, or it shows people, that if something like this happens, and if it was a rebellion, the Articles of Confederation would not be adequate to be able to put this down. So it convinces people that we need a stronger federal government, a stronger central government. So people meet again to try to revise the Articles of Confederation, and out of that comes the Constitution that we have today. So we roll on, they meet to try to revise the articles, and they end up writing the Constitution. And the biggest, obviously, the Constitution is the most important document in this country, but for our purposes, you need to be aware of the compromises that made this possible. And the two big ones, number one is the Great Compromise that deals with representation in Congress. Okay, you had two plans on the table at this time. You had the New Jersey plan, which was obviously put forth by the state of New Jersey, that said that representation should be equal across the board. In other words, every state should have the same number of representatives. Well, they did this because they're a small state and they don't have a lot of population. So if they did it by population, which is what the state of Virginia, in the creatively named Virginia plan, wanted to do, New Jersey wouldn't have a lot of reps because Virginia plan said that representation should be based on population. So what they do is they compromise and they put these two together and they end up with what we have now, which is a bicameral legislation with a House of Representatives and a Senate. One side of it based on population for representation, the other one equal across the board. Another one also dealt with representation, and it was what to do about slaves in the South. Well, slave owners and people in the South wanted slaves to count as a full person for representation purposes because it would greatly increase the number of representatives that they had in the House. Well, northern states are like, no, that's not cool, man. We should do it as a percentage of people. That way it kind of evens it up or levels it off. And what they come up with is the 3/5 compromise, where each slave would be counted as 3/5 of a man for representative purposes. So what we end up with is two camps when it comes to ratifying or whether this Constitution is going to work. And you've got the Federalists on one side and the Anti-Federalists on the other. And the Federalists are the ones who want the Constitution. They're the ones that want this seemingly powerful federal government. And they try to go out and get support for their views by writing a series of essays, I guess you could call it, in newspapers called the Federalist Papers. And it's to support the ratification of the Constitution. Written by Alexander Hamilton and James Madison. Let's see. They were talking about how a large republic offered the best protection of minority rights in an expanded republic. With tyranny by the majority would be impossible. And then you have anti-federalists on the other side who are scared of a lot of central authority because they feel like A, it takes away power from the states, and B, it would be very easy to slip into the things that led us to the revolution in the first place. A lot of the people, the characteristics of anti-federalists, they were normally farmers from rural areas, people who were more worried about local things and were scared about the federal government coming in and impacting their lives. People who were scared that Congress would levy heavy taxes, feared that there would be a standing army that could, come into their area at any time. Believed that the new national government would overwhelm the states and that individual rights needed to be protected. And that's where the Bill of Rights comes down the line. Okay, the Bill of Rights was not originally in the Constitution. It was added later as a concession to get it ratified. Very briefly, we're going to roll into Chapter 5, the New Nation. Forgive the formatting on the slide here. It's just what happens when you convert it. But 1789 to 1824, from the Constitution, time Constitution is ratified, to the era of Jackson. And I'm going to do about a minute on this one, and then we'll pick up with it in the next part. First thing we're going to deal with as a part of this is the economic policies of Alexander Hamilton, who was the first Secretary of the Treasury. And he's got a couple of purposes of why he's going to go with the policies he does. First of all, he realizes we've got to have some sense of economic growth in this country, and the fact that, remember, we're kind of starting from scratch. Yeah, we've got some manufacturing, a little bit of industry, and obviously farming in the South, but overall, we're nowhere near as economically powerful as already established countries. So we've got to grow our economy. We've also got to strengthen our finances and our credit. We've also got to, from his point of view, make it worthwhile for Eastern merchants to buy into his policies, because he realizes they're probably going to be important down the road. So how's he going to set this thing up? How's he going to make it work? Well, as far as his proposals go, number one, he's going to set up a national bank. He's going to put in a protective tariff for American manufacturing, and also as a way to raise money from imported foreign goods. He's also going to fund the national debt and assume state debts. And assume state debts simply means we're going to take all the debts that states had from the Revolutionary War, and the federal government's going to pay them off. Also, they're going to put taxes on distilled liquor, which leads to the Whiskey Rebellion, and the fact that one of these taxes, obviously, that's distilled liquor, it was on whiskey, and these farmers didn't want to pay it. So they kind of form a little uprising and protested against it, and George Washington goes in and crushes it with overwhelming force. And he does this to send a message and to set the tone that the federal government is not something to be messed with, okay? Something he has to do. Washington, by the way, was a Federalist, so he felt it was completely in his rights to go in and do this. But like I said, he had to do it to send a message to other people not to protest, not to uprise. This is the way it's going to be, and that's what we're going to do going forward. So this wraps up part 2. We'll move on to part 3 and continue on with the new nation on the next one.